Now, as the race to the White House enters its final stretch, Georgia remains one of 7 swing states likely to decide who will become the next U.S. president. Georgia remains contentious. The Republican-aligned State Election Board has passed a bunch of controversial rules. It requires all counties to perform a hand count of ballots cast on Election Day. Let's take a closer look at this battleground state and why things are so close to call.
Joe Biden narrowly won Georgia in the 2020 U.S. elections. The margin was razor thin. He became the first candidate at the top of the Democratic ticket to do so since 1992. The victory came after a gap of 18 long years. Once again, the Harris-Walz campaign is pushing hard to turn the critical swing state blue, and they are sparing no quarter. In the latest, former President Bill Clinton has also been roped into campaign for the blue camp in Georgia on Sunday and Monday, but the red camp is in no mood to shy away from a direct fight. Former President Donald Trump cannot afford a rerun of the 2020 defeat. It is mobilizing to win over essential voting blocks in areas like Metro Atlanta. But why? Without the 16 electoral college votes from this key state, Trump's path to victory in 2024 also narrows significantly. Voters are being constantly inundated by political advertising and bombarded with visits from campaign surrogates from both the camps. The latest polls suggest that Trump is on track to flip Georgia after losing it in 2020. However, they also reveal that Harris has narrowed his lead in the state that shifted from red to blue. It will be interesting to see who is able to navigate the shifting sands of Georgia's electorate and win America's race to power. With Arjun Samar Mahindran, Samya Afsar for NDTV World.
All right, let's take a closer look at swing state Georgia, which, as we've seen, remains too close to call for both Harris and Trump. We're joined by Sonjani Kumar. She is with a group called South Asians for Harris. Also joining us, a Republican strategist, Alex Dan. Plus, we have Michael Fauntroy. He is Associate Professor of Policy and Government at George Mason University. Let me come to you first, Alex. Georgia has a state election board, as we heard there, which is Republican controlled. 3 of 5 members are Trump endorsed. Trump has called them pit bulls fighting for honesty. The board has introduced 2 controversial measures. One is hand counting ballots. We'll get to the second one in just a bit. But Alex, why is it necessary to count ballots by hand when machines really do a perfectly good job?
Well, what's first and foremost most necessary is for people to come out to vote. That's what the Trump campaign is behind right now, doing in Georgia, in Pennsylvania, in those other swing states. Turnout is going to be key. We look at those polls and we see these races are razor thin. They're going to be determined by the amount of people who either mail in their ballots before Election Day, as the law provides, or show up to vote early or on Election Day. This election's going to be decided by turnout. Georgia's no exception. I'm really looking forward to the push in these final days. President Trump was in Evans, Georgia last week, rallying up crowds there. This is going to be a ground game with a big push to November 5th. President Trump is in a very good position to flip Georgia and take back the presidency.
Alex, but why hand count those ballots?
Hand counting ballots is fine. Machine counting ballots is fine. Tabulations are done within the most strict viewing and ensuring that those ballots will be counted fairly. I'm not in Georgia. I'm not a member of the Georgia Board of Elections. Whatever they've decided to do is response to what they're seeing on the ground. It's not uncommon to have some hand counting going on, especially for those provisional ballots that are going to be coming in the next days and weeks.
Sonjay, okay, you support Kamala Harris. Tell us why Democrats and others have taken this matter to court in a bid to block the hand counting of ballots. Help us understand why it's a problem. Why are alarm bells being rung on this front?
Yeah, thank you so much for having me. And also, I want to mention that I am not a member of any of the lawsuits. I'm not part of any of the lawsuits that have been filed. But what we as Democrats supporting Kamala Harris understand clearly that this is last minute chaos that is being brought into the election process. having election rules changed after everybody has been trained. I think it was just 5-6 weeks before the election that some of these rules were introduced. They are meant to sow distrust. I found it interesting that your GOP strategist said that we want everyone to come out to vote and to have faith in the vote. Well, these types of actions being taken at the last minute sow distrust within the voter community, and sometimes preclude people from voting because they think it's all rigged and something's wrong and the elections are stolen, and all of the disinformation we heard coming out of 2020. These rules are a direct product of the big lie. The big lie that something went wrong in Georgia and the votes were not properly counted. All these rules are, the Trump team coming in through the newly constituted state election board and sowing distrust through these rules.
Okay. All right, let's get Michael in here. Michael, what do you think? Is this just a benign move, or are you also worried, like Sanjanu was saying, about maybe delays of reporting of election results, opening the doors to potential fraud? What's your take on the matter?
So this has been part of a long-standing attempt to have more political control from Republicans on the electoral process in Georgia. The state has become much more competitive and much more of a swing state as demographics change, and Republicans, and particularly conservatives in the far right wing in Georgia, is concerned that they will lose control over statewide outcomes. So a lot of this has been an attempt to sort of put the toothpaste back in the tube, so to speak. And in so doing, it has created a new regime led by these new state election board leaders who are not just Republican, but activist, sort of right-wing Republicans, to create a system that's more easily challengeable if it turns out that Republicans, and in this case, Donald Trump, don't win in November. They want to make it easier to challenge and undermine those outcomes. And so that's at the root of what we're seeing. And to get to this point, you have to look at a decision that the Supreme Court made some time ago in which they invalidated the Voting Rights Act, or part of the Voting Rights Act. There was a provision in that act that required these kinds of changes to go through federal approval called preclearance. Well, that was struck down, and now states ever since have been engaging in all manner of rule changes, even up as close to as we are right now to an election, that I think creates a number of problems.
Alex, the other contentious rule here that was introduced is local officials can conduct an inquiry before they sign off on final results. This can be seen as, a delaying tactic. Michael mentioned if, Trump decides to say the election is stolen, the election board may not certify the results even if all is okay. Wouldn't this really undermine public confidence and create chaos like some of the guests have been talking about?
I'm pretty surprised to see it characterized that way because the right to challenge is part of the process. If you're anywhere from a city council race to a race for president of the United States, if you believe that the race was tight enough, that additional evidence could indicate that you are actually the victor, you have a right to go to court under our system. You have a right to challenge. You have a right to inquire. To characterize these descriptions of basic fundamental rights that candidates have as anti-democratic are nothing more than scare tactics on the part of Democrats to motivate their own base. It is cynicism of the highest order.
That right existed. That right existed before these changes were made. So there's no reason to have more of them. Right. So what's the point? If the change already existed, if the right to challenge already existed, then why do we have to have additional rights to challenge?
What's the point? You're saying, what's the point? There could be challenges at any level, and those challenges will be heard by the proper courts and the proper authorities and be determined to have merit or not. An inquiry is not fixing the result of an election. A delay is something that might displease you, but it's within your rights as a candidate.
Yeah, exactly. These
Sanjay, why don't you jump in here? Your time to rebuke.
Exactly. These rights have already existed. And as we know, that Trump famously brought 60 lawsuits and lost them all. And especially in Georgia, he really tried hard to find those votes. So these are a direct result of the big lie in 2020 that somehow the votes were fraudulent or they were stolen. So this is adding another layer. And it could be seen as a benign administrative process as it has for 200 plus years, except as we know, Mr. Trump has turned every benign administrative rule to his advantage. And something as simple as a certification, which is statutorily required by both Georgia and federal law, could be used to create havoc, chaos, and get in the way of the results being certified. November 12th is the day Georgia results have to be certified. If you allow people to have reasonable inquiries, what does that mean? Does that mean that those votes don't count that you have reasonable inquiry for? We already have a process, as Alex has rightly said, for candidates to challenge votes, to challenge election processes. They're perfectly fine. Why did we have to introduce a new rule 5 weeks before the election that adds another layer?
Michael, Biden's surprising 2020 victory in Georgia was the first win for a Democratic presidential candidate since 1992. Georgia has long been a conservative stronghold. And so why the sudden turnaround to a swing state? Can you give us a bit of context there? What made it kind of turn around to giving it that status of a battleground state or a swing state?
You know, this had been brewing for much of the last 30 years as Georgia, North Carolina, and perhaps one or two other states in Arizona have had more racial diversity, more impact from international business and corporate interests that have drawn Americans from other parts of the country to Georgia. You've seen a more competitive statewide electoral ecosystem develop. And so what we're seeing right now is part of the continuation of what we saw in 2020. And I would imagine it would continue to be so going forward. You know, I live and work in the Commonwealth of Virginia, and we were having the same conversations about Virginia 10, 12, 14 years ago, because Virginia used to be one of those kinds of states, and now it has moved. Georgia is now in transition, and which helps to explain why some of these rules are being changed, because some want to hold off that transition as long as possible.
Yeah. Can I jump in?
We're going to be on our edge of our seats waiting to see how Georgia votes. Very quickly.
I moved to Georgia 30 years ago. I used to be the lone Democrat in some parts of, where I lived in Cobb County. Georgia looks more like the rest of the country now. And because Georgia looks like more of the country, the Democratic Party is rising and winning seats. And this is why we also see, we haven't talked about this, but gerrymandering of so many districts to consolidate and limit the vote of so many Georgians.
Alistair, their governor is Republican. I'll point that out. That's a fact.
Thank you very much indeed. Running out of time there. I'm afraid we'll hope to have you guys on again before November 5th. Hopefully, Alex, Sanjay, and Michael, thank you for your time this morning on US Election Watch here on NDTV.